This week, Hungary sent a message to Brussels. You can outvote us, but you can't erase the consequences. Because while Europe tries to lock in support for Ukraine and reduce its dependence on Russia, Budapest is pushing in the opposite direction, legally, politically, and strategically. And the real story isn't one headline. It's how three separate issues, frozen Russian assets, energy security, and Hungary's role inside NATO and the EU, are now converging into one bigger question. Is Hungary drifting away from the European mainstream, or positioning itself as the last holdout against a policy it believes is unsustainable? Hello everyone, and welcome to Hungary and Beyond. If you find calm, structured analysis like this useful, consider subscribing and turning on notifications so you don't miss future episodes. Now, let's break down what happened this week in Hungarian foreign policy and why it matters. Let's start with the biggest diplomatic fault line of the week: frozen Russian assets. For months, European leaders have debated what to do with Russian state assets held in Europe, especially funds immobilized after Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The strategic logic from many EU capitals is straightforward. Ukraine needs long-term financing, and the EU wants Russia to pay part of the bill. But the problem is legal and political, because moving from freezing assets to using assets raises enormous questions. What legal basis allows it? What precedent does it set? And what happens to trust in European financial systems if state reserves can be repurposed during geopolitical disputes? This week, according to reporting, the EU moved toward a mechanism that would indefinitely freeze Russian assets, reducing the ability of member states to block future renewals that previously required unanimity. Hungary's reaction was sharp. Prime Minister Viktor Orbán described the approach as unlawful, warning it crosses a line, both legally and politically. Now, whether you agree with Orbán or not, Hungary's position here follows a consistent pattern. Budapest argues that the EU is increasingly willing to bend legal norms, especially on security and finance, when consensus is hard to achieve. Critics respond, consensus can't become a veto weapon. If a small number of states can repeatedly block policy in an existential crisis, the Union becomes paralyzed. And this is the core tension. One side says, Europe must act fast and collectively. The other says, Europe must remain bound by strict legal limits, or it risks becoming arbitrary. This debate also showed up at the EU level in discussions about financial assistance for Ukraine. This week, EU leaders finalized a large financial package, described as a €90 billion loan, even as they struggle to fully agree on using frozen Russian assets as collateral or a funding base. The key point for Hungary's foreign policy isn't the exact number. It's that Hungary aligns with a group of states that are skeptical of escalation, legal or financial, when the long-term consequences are unclear. Hungary's argument in simplified terms is, if the EU normalizes the use of frozen state assets, it could trigger retaliation, legal blowback, and a loss of confidence in Europe as a financial safe haven. Meanwhile, many EU leaders argue the opposite. If Europe doesn't find long-term funding mechanisms, Ukraine's position weakens, and that carries security consequences for everyone. So where does that leave Hungary? Hungary is not simply against Ukraine financing. Hungary is against a specific method, one it frames as legally dangerous and strategically escalatory. And that sets up the second major theme of this week. Because in Hungary's foreign policy worldview, energy security is not separate from Ukraine policy. It's part of the same battlefield. While Hungary objects to EU moves on Russian assets and long-term war financing, it is also trying to manage something very practical. How do you keep the lights on cheaply through winter and beyond? This week, Hungary's energy diplomacy ran on two tracks at the same time. Track A, keep Russian gas flowing through Turkey. Orban said Turkey would guarantee the route for continued Russian gas flow to Hungary, reinforcing the importance of the Turk Stream corridor. This matters because Hungary has been one of the EU's most consistent voices arguing that rapid decoupling from Russian energy is economically damaging, and for some countries, not realistically replaceable in the short term. Critics say this makes Hungary vulnerable and politically exposed. Supporters say it's not ideology, it's geography and infrastructure. Either way, this is a foreign policy choice. Hungary is anchoring itself to an energy corridor that remains tied to Russia, mediated through Turkey. And that brings Ankara into Hungary's strategic picture as a kind of energy guarantor. Track B. Diversify with the United States, Chevron LNG deal. At the same time, Hungary announced a deal that points in another direction. A 5-year agreement involving Hungary's state energy group, MVM, and US company Chevron to supply LNG volumes. Hungarian Foreign Minister Péter Szijjártó presented this as part of a broader diversification push, securing supply and keeping prices manageable. This is important because it complicates the simplistic narrative that Hungary is only tied to Russia. Hungary's strategy is more like: keep Russian pipeline gas as the baseline, add Western LNG as an insurance policy, fight EU regulations that would force a full decoupling on a fixed timeline. That last point matters because earlier this month, Hungary said it would challenge the EU decision to phase out Russian energy imports at the EU's Court of Justice. So, if you step back, you see the logic. Hungary is not just complaining. Hungary is actively constructing a posture. 1. Maintain Russian supply routes. 2. Build alternative supply options. 3. Contest EU mandates legally. This is foreign policy executed through infrastructure, contracts, and courts, not just speeches. And it leads into the third theme of the week: Hungary's relationship with NATO and the broader war narrative in Europe. This week also highlighted a messaging battle inside the Western alliance. According to reports, Szijjártó criticized warnings that Russia could be in a position to attack NATO within a few years, calling such statements reckless. Now, there are 2 layers to this. Layer 1. The public narrative. Many Western leaders argue that preparing for a long-term confrontation is necessary to deter further aggression. Hungary argues that aggressive rhetoric can become a self-fulfilling spiral. It hardens positions, reduces room for diplomacy, and frames the future as inevitable confrontation. Hungary's officials have repeatedly stressed that Europe should prioritize ceasefire pathways and negotiation incentives. And in Hungarian government messaging, this often comes with the claim that European elites are not interested in peace. Hungary's official communication channels highlighted that line again this week. Layer 2. The internal alliance tension. But even if you set rhetoric aside, there is a structural disagreement within NATO and the EU about end-state strategy. Some states believe Ukraine must be supported until it wins maximal aims. Others believe a negotiated settlement is inevitable and should be pursued earlier to limit long-term damage. Hungary is firmly closer to the second camp. Critics say this stance rewards aggression. Supporters say it reduces the risk of Europe locking itself into permanent war footing. Either way, Hungary's foreign policy line is not ambiguous. It wants to avoid deeper involvement, open-ended commitments, and escalation steps that become irreversible, which is exactly why the frozen assets issue matters so much. Because from Hungary's viewpoint, that's not just finance, it's escalation. Now, one more thread that ties this week together: Hungary versus Brussels on rules and sovereignty. Hungary's dispute with the EU isn't only about Russia, Ukraine, or energy. it's also about the internal mechanics of the EU. Hungary's leadership frames many recent EU actions as an overreach, where Brussels uses legal mechanisms and qualified majority voting to bypass national veto power. Supporters of the EU's approach argue that veto power has been abused and that the Union needs tools to act decisively, especially in security crises. This is not just an abstract argument. It affects how Hungary positions itself internationally, because if the EU is seen in Budapest as legally flexible, then Hungary feels justified in seeking parallel partnerships. With Turkey on energy routing, with US firms on LNG, and maintaining channels that keep Russian energy flowing. In other words, the more Hungary feels boxed in by Brussels, the more it behaves like a state hedging its alliances. And this has consequences for the next year. Because the EU's 2027 target to end Russian gas imports is approaching, and Hungary has signaled it will fight this legally and politically. So what are the forward signals? The things to watch in the coming days? Here are 4. 1. The legal pathway on Russian assets. If the EU locks in indefinite freezing and uses assets more aggressively, Hungary's opposition may intensify, either through legal challenge, political alliance building, or veto fights elsewhere. 2. Energy diversification versus dependence. Watch whether Hungary increases actual LNG imports over time, or keeps Russian pipeline gas as the dominant pillar. The Chevron deal is significant, but volume and pricing will determine whether it changes the reality. 3. Hungary's NATO messaging. If NATO leaders continue emphasizing a multi-year confrontation, Hungary may continue pushing back rhetorically and position itself as the voice of de-escalation inside the alliance. 4. The EU's unity narrative. A major theme in European politics right now is unity, especially around Ukraine support. But the internal fractures are real. This week's loan agreement shows the EU can still act, but not without visible tension. This week, Hungarian foreign policy looked less like a set of disconnected headlines and more like a coherent posture. A posture built on 3 principles: resist legal and financial escalation in the Ukraine war, secure energy supply through both eastern and western channels, push back against Brussels when Hungary believes EU rules are being stretched. You may agree or disagree with Hungary's approach, but it is clearly shaping Budapest's relationships with Brussels, with NATO, with Washington, and with Turkey. And as Europe moves toward a longer period of strategic rivalry, this tension between unity and national sovereignty is likely to become louder, not quieter. If you found this breakdown useful, consider subscribing. And let me ask you one question. Is Hungary protecting its national interests or isolating itself inside Europe at the worst possible time? Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next episode of Hungary and Beyond.